Coming up on today's show, Marie Thouin, PhD, is the author of What is Compersion? Understanding Positive Empathy in Consensually Non-Monogamous Relationships, the first ever comprehensive scholarly book on compersion. She has been featured in several magazines and podcasts, including Elle, The Savage Lovecast, and Multiamory. Marie has also published seminal research studies, the first encyclopedia entry on compersion, and is the creator of whatiscompersion.com, a popular website that features her research, blogs, and a list of resources on the topic of compersion. She is also the founder of Love in Sight, a mindful dating and relationship coaching practice where she supports and guides people of all backgrounds and relational orientations to create intentional and vibrant love lives. Welcome to Loving Without Boundaries, where we hear inspiring stories, share actionable advice, and talk about the challenges and the joys of ethical non-monogamy and polyamory. I'm your host, Kitty Chambliss. Welcome back to Loving Without Boundaries, where I am really, truly excited to be here with Dr. Marie Thouin, who is the author of What is Compersion? Understanding Positive Empathy in Consensually Non-Monogamous Relationships, and also somebody that I've come to know and love who's been on our podcast before. So I'm delighted to have a deeper conversation about all things compersion with you today. So thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to be here.
Thank you so much, Kitty. It's such an honor to be here again as my research evolves.
Yes, and that's amazing. I love how you're like a dog with a bone in a good way. Like you found something that really interests you and you're just diving in deeper, as I have in my own work as well. And I just want to thank you for all of the research and gifts that you've been able to give our community, since there isn't a ton of research on a lot of this. So thank you.
Oh my gosh, it's my pleasure. And, sometimes it makes it fun when there isn't a ton already. There is all this room for asking a lot of questions, a lot of fundamental questions about stuff. So I'm feeling very fortunate that I picked a research topic that has not gotten boring, and I don't anticipate it getting boring ever.
That's a great way to look at it. I love that. So before we go any further, I have, of course, shared your bio with everyone, but I'd love it if you would just give a brief introduction for anyone who maybe isn't that familiar with you or your work.
Absolutely. So I'm Dr. Marie Thouin. I am a French-Canadian woman living in California for the past 20-ish years, and I'm a dating and relationship coach. So I work with folks really across the spectrum of identities and backgrounds and monogamy and non-monogamy. And my whole mission in life is to promote intentional relationships, moving away from the default assumptions that we have around how we should construct our relational lives and really discovering what we do have in our hearts to create collectively with the people that we care about. So, yeah, I just love my job, and I'm also a researcher. I started researching compersion when I was doing my PhD back in, 2014 to 2021, and now I just came up with a book that's based on that research from my PhD plus additional research I've done in the past few years. So super stoked to share that with the world.
I'm super stoked for you, and I'm excited to be able to share it with our listeners here. So before we get too deep into it, I'd love it if first maybe you shared what were some of the reasons, the epiphanies or light bulb moments that you had that were reasons that you decided to write this book in the first place.
Yeah. Well, the reason why I decided to study compersion in the first place is that when I first encountered the word compersion, there was a light bulb that went on for me, and that felt that, that is at the core of what I consider real love. And not necessarily in a context of non-monogamy, but in a context that just allows for us to celebrate the successes of others and sort of transcend the competitiveness that we often learn to have in society. Like when you actually decide that someone is on your team and you want them to thrive, you want them to be successful. You want them to grow into the fullest expression of who they are, and you want to support that. To me, that's the crux of compersion, and that's the crux of real love. So I was really curious about how that applies in intimate relationships, in consensual non-monogamy, where there's such deep enculturation around we should all be monogamous, we should all feel jealous when our partner is with someone else, there's no alternative to that, and we're constructing a whole, social structure of monogamy and mononormativity, the idea that monogamy is the only valid way to construct relationships, based on that false assumption that jealousy would be the only way to feel when something outside of a couple happens intimately. So I just think it's a linchpin of a new paradigm, of a more liberated paradigm of intimate relationships. And, there's a lot of misconceptions about it as well. When you talk to folks in the poly community and you talk about compersion, there's a lot of controversies and sometimes misconceptions or even weaponization of that term. So I think that's important to talk about that too.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. And I definitely see that a lot in the work that I do here. And so before we go too much further, I'd love it if you'd give a definition in your own words of what compersion is, and also a springboard from that of why can't we find that word in the dictionary? And why do every time I type it, including preparing for this interview, it says, that's not a real word. You must autocorrect this word, right? It usually goes to comparison, which I think is kind of funny.
It's hilarious. I know. Yeah, my computer also serves me a lot of autocorrects like conversion or compression.
Compression. Compression is the other one I get too.
Compersion.
Not at all. Not at all.
Okay, so in my own words, really, the concept of compersion is about moving away from jealousy and possessiveness in our way that we love. It's the antonym of jealousy. I wouldn't say necessarily the opposite, because that would imply they're mutually exclusive, and they're not. Compersion and jealousy can definitely coexist. But to get into more detail about what the definition is, I actually co-authored a definition with Dr. Sharon Flicker last year, and she was on your podcast as well. I think we were together discussing her previous research. But we came up with a 3-part definition for an encyclopedia of sexual behavior and psychology. And so the first 2 parts have to do with non-monogamy. The first one being that compersion is a broad range of positive emotions that we might experience in relation to our partner's other intimate relationships. And that's what we normally think about when we think about compersion. It's, I'm happy for you when you're intimate or romantic with someone else. The second definition, though, is the broad range of positive thoughts, attitudes, and behaviors that we might experience in connection to our partner's other relationships. And that means that compersion is not just an emotion. It can also be an orientation towards a relationship, a behavioral and attitudinal orientation. And I discuss that more in my book. And then the third definition is opening it up beyond non-monogamy and to include different other circumstances. So compersion can also be, and it's being used as, a broad range of positive emotions, thoughts, behaviors, and attitudes in relation to somebody else's success and gratifying experience in any context. So kind of taking it out of polyamory and broadening it to greater contexts.
Meaning also like friendships and other ways that it can show up there as well. Yeah,
exactly.
And I'm really glad that you both came up with that third definition, and having it be the third, because I think it's really important to realize that we can learn and practice or notice when we're feeling compersion in these other ways. And same thing with jealousy. Like jealousy can come up in any context. It's not just isolated to polyamory or consensual non-monogamy. So just noticing that it is a feeling, and we can have that feeling anywhere. Yeah.
And then to your question about why is it not in a dictionary yet? Well, I actually emailed the editors of Merriam-Webster's, and a few years ago they responded saying, well, it's not well known enough or broadly used enough to warrant inclusion in the dictionary. So I've emailed them again a couple times in the last 4 years, and I haven't gotten a response. But I think it's getting closer because now it's at least in an encyclopedia, which I think is a good step in between. And well, if any of the listeners want to also email the dictionary editors, that might actually help.
That's important. I will make sure to put that on my to-do list. And awesome. When did it go into the encyclopedia?
In 2023.
Oh, very cool. That's awesome. So before we go too much further, I'd love to, and we've got some great topics to cover here. I definitely see in the community and when working with clients that there can be some shame around not feeling compersion or shame around feeling jealousy. And a lot of times I talk with people just to let them know that all of their feelings are normal and natural. It's just a matter of learning how to understand what those emotions are telling you and to know that you can build different ways to maneuver through those. So I wondered if you could touch on what we've talked about actually before, but for our listeners here and with your deeper research, that spectrum of compersion, partly through the lens of dropping any weaponization or shame around it.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think one of the main criticisms of the term or the concept of compersion is that people oftentimes do feel like they have to feel compersion emotionally or else they're not a good poly person. And that's just not true because, of course, no one feels compersion all the time. First of all, let's clear that up. Like, I've talked to a lot of poly people in my practice who might have been very compersive for years until a certain situation or metaphor or context just got them triggered. Mm-hmm. And it's really contextual. I'm saying that to say, like, you know, if you're not feeling or experiencing compersion right now, like, the context might change one day and you'll be very surprised to find yourself experiencing it and vice versa. So it's not an on or off switch. You know, it's not like, oh, you're either compersive or you're not. Mm-hmm. And if you are struggling to experience compersion or even okayness in a non-monogamous situation, I always encourage people to use that as a flashlight, not a stick. Like you said, you know, like jealousy and challenging emotions can definitely carry a lot of information that you might need about your relationship. The trick is to not just necessarily put any of these feelings in charge of your relationship and to be, you know, the benevolent parent of your emotions, so to speak, in like internal family systems language. And to decide what are we going to do with all these feelings and all that information. So yes, definitely don't blame yourself or your partners if there is a lack or perceived lack of compersion. And I always also recommend, and I emphasize that a lot in my book, it's more productive to create a fertile terrain for compersion through different, you know, like individual, relational, or social factors that you can really act upon. It's easier to go the route of creating that fertile terrain rather than just trying to invoke compersion in a context that is not really promoting it. You can spiritually bypass yourself into compersion.
Yeah, very important. One term that I saw in your book that I thought was really powerful was that term benevolent neutrality and working towards relational security and harmony, which can be very healthy versus when it can be like there might be disrespectful or harmful dynamics that can go on. And like you said, where there could be some gaslighting or, as you mentioned, some spiritual bypassing. Can you touch on that a little bit?
Yeah, totally. So I designed this spectrum of compersion from jealousy to benevolent neutrality to attitudinal compersion to embodied compersion. So embodied compersion is when you're feeling it emotionally and in your body and you're just really happy and excited for your partner, experiencing a positive experience with somebody else. The attitudinal conversion is when it's more of a cerebral realization that this is a good thing happening, but you're not necessarily feeling emotionally thrilled. Or the benevolent neutrality is when you're just kind of neutral. You're not feeling distressed and you're not necessarily feeling happy. You're just okay. And that can really be enough to create successful non-monogamous relationships. You know, like if you're coming from a place of feeling sort of scared, sort of threatened, sort of like uncomfortable with non-monogamy, I would just aim for benevolent neutrality. I would not put yourself the additional pressure of thinking you should be feeling compersion right now. So it helps kind of ease that potential pressure that the idea of compersion can bring. And again, you mentioned like there's situations where people are in unhealthy or abusive dynamics, or just even sometimes power dynamics that are not very equal, or, you know, there can be a lack of respect where one person might feel like they have more options or more freedom, and one person feels like they're left with the short end of the stick in the non-monogamous dynamic, and that can definitely block compersion, and that's kind of normal, you know?
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful segue into moving into the topic of, which I love all your additional research on this. What would you say promotes compersion for an individual and in a relationship, and also what hinders that?
Yeah, so my book lays out 6 different factors that promote and hinder compersion. So they're categorized within individual, relational, and social categories. So I'll just run through them, and I'll say both kind of what promotes compersion and what hinders compersion within that.
Sure.
I'll also contextualize it in the form of an analogy. Imagine that you are driving a car and there's a brake pedal and there's a gas pedal. And when you hit the gas pedal, it accelerates the car. And when you hit the brake pedal, it stops it or slows it down. And with compersion, like those factors can act as acceleration or brake. And so, you know, it's a very helpful thing to keep in mind. Like it's not, again, like an on or off switch. It's more of a, you know, what does the context promote? So in terms of individual factors, first you have the ideological commitment to non-monogamous values. And that means being fully on board with being in the non-monogamous setup with your partner or partners. If you're not fully in a place of self-consent, if you're not fully on board, if you might have felt kind of pressured or coerced into non-monogamy, and you're really still preferring monogamy, it will be much harder to experience compersion than if you're fully on board, if you're fully enthusiastic about it, if you're fully aligned with values like, oh yeah, I really do think that love can be abundant and we can care for many people at the same time, and I want me and my partners to have erotic autonomy, and so on. So that's kind of the mental part of this picture. The second individual factor is security within self. And that is, how well resourced do I feel individually? Do I feel like my life in, you know, outside of my relationships is full of goodness? Do I take care of myself? Am I doing okay at work? Am I doing okay in my body? And these things can really fluctuate, but they really will impact. Again, like imagine that brake and accelerator pedal in a car. You know, are you going to be able to feel compersion or experience compersion in different moments? And also, do I feel a sense of solidity within myself? Do I feel like, okay, I might feel some fear and a sense of threat if my partner is going on a date with someone else, but ultimately I feel that I'm really going to have my own back in that. And even in a worst case scenario, maybe they do fall in love with that person and run away and break up with me. Could I still be okay? Could I still have a sense of okayness in life, even if there would be a lot of grief or whatnot? That sense of inner security is really important to them, feeling, okay, I have enough to give, I have enough to share. All of that.
Powerful.
So moving on to the relational factors. The first one is relational security. And that has to do with how secure do I feel with my partners? Do I feel like there's an abundance and maybe even a saturation of love and affection and time and resources? Because if I feel like there's enough and more than enough, then I'm going to feel more comfortable sharing and inviting other people to share into those resources. And then the second one in the relational category is how I feel about my metamors. Do I feel like they're bringing something to the table? Do I feel trust towards them? Do I feel like they're treating my partner well? Do I like them as a person? Do I think they're cool? And the flip side of that would be, oh, no, I don't really trust them, and I don't think they are supportive of my relationship with our common partner. That would definitely slow down your compersion train if you didn't have a good rapport with those people.
That makes sense. And the same with the relational security that would hinder is when maybe you're feeling that lack of abundance, like you're not maybe getting enough time with your partner, maybe your needs aren't getting fully met. They seem extremely distracted, things like that.
Exactly.
Okay. Yeah, and it makes a lot of sense.
And then the third factor in the relational category would be the perception of benefits derived by your partner's other relationships. And that asks, do I feel like I'm gaining something from this relationship? Am I getting a more joyful partner at the end of the day when they come back to me? Am I feeling maybe less pressured to fulfill all of my partner's needs? Does that feel like a plus? Does that feel like a benefit? In other words, what do I have to be grateful for in this situation? As that definitely will enhance compersion.
That makes sense. And then the flip side of that is when one is not able to see those benefits, or maybe they're not as many benefits there as really need to be for, it's starting to make sense how it can start to get weaponized, right? So that makes sense as well. Or is there anything else you'd like to say about how it could be hindered from that benefit perspective?
Yeah, like when someone is left saying like, well, what am I getting out of this? You know, if they're left feeling like they're maybe paying a price that's high for them in terms of sacrificing time with their partner, or, you know, like they feel like they're not gaining anything, but they're actually sacrificing more than what they're getting, it can be a block to compersion.
Yeah. And I assume in a lot of your coaching work, it's also peeling apart what's the truth, right? Because sometimes people might be telling themselves stories or limiting beliefs. So as a third party, I assume part of your job is to figure out like what is actually true, what is actually happening. Is this really true or not? You know, sometimes it is and sometimes it isn't, right?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. I mean, it's so easy for all of us to feel victimized and feel like we are getting the short end of the stick. And, you know, like you said, like what is really true? Can we peel back the layers? And if there is a power imbalance, or, you know, someone is not getting what they need to feel okay, what can we bring in as strategies to rectify that and to bring more resources in that picture where there is a lack?
Love that. Yeah. Beautiful.
And then the last factor is the social factor, and that is community belonging. And as you know, I know you create a lot of community around non-monogamous folks. It's so much easier to walk that path as a non-monogamous person if you have community around you to support you, to validate your identity, which is still a marginalized identity in the world, and to provide that kind of role model, to provide that kind of support system. So people who do have other friends who are non-monogamous, they then, have somebody to call when things are hard. And they also can witness other people going through those kinds of experiences and also potentially modeling compersion. I've had a participant in my study tell me that he was not able to really feel compersion until he saw it modeled by other people, not in his polycule, but he saw other people feeling good and feeling okay when they were witnessing their partner be with someone else. And he said it just kind of clicked in his mind, and he was like, oh, I saw that it could be okay, so I let it be okay.
Kind of making a decision. Yeah.
Yeah, and just kind of, in a way jumping from, oh, compersion is a fun idea, but it feels very theoretical and out of reach, to, oh, here it is in front of my eyes.
So, and it might even look rather joyful, right? I mean, because some people will describe it as sympathetic joy or positive empathy. So maybe he also saw like a benefit when he saw maybe the person's face light up when they were feeling compersion for their partner, and maybe how that benefited them,
Exactly. Yeah. And I mean, we are very empathetic creatures of those mirror neurons. So we can, we easily imitate other people.
That's awesome. I love that. And then so the hindering from the social, that would be when somebody doesn't have community, they don't have role models around them. Anything else that you'd want to highlight there for when the social piece would hinder?
Yeah. And I mean, one of the main reasons why sometimes people would tell me that they didn't have community around them was from a marginalized identity, like a marginalized racial identity, particularly. I've talked to a lot of BIPOC folks who said that in their own city, all the poly communities that they could find were overwhelmingly white, and they didn't see themselves represented, and so they didn't totally feel comfortable walking into those kinds of communities. So I think that's kind of a great call for, poly communities all around the globe to try to promote diversity so that everyone can be included. And I don't think it's just race. I think there's also, some ageism sometimes prevalent in some communities. There's, like discrimination based on so many different identities, which I do get into a little bit more in my book as well. That's a big topic to unpack, and there's a lot of facets there. But yeah.
Yeah, and I appreciate all those different perspectives, including mentioning ageism. I work with people who identify as polyamorous and also people who identify more as swingers or in an open relationship. And I'm sure you know that a lot of those communities will have like an age gap. Like you must be this, this age range to join this group, or you're not allowed in, and I'm actually 55 at the time of this recording, so I would even be excluded in some of those ways too. So that's interesting that you mentioned that. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, it's heartbreaking when you think about it. Like, oh, I was 54 last year and I could join this amazing community, and now I'm 55 and I can't.
Yeah.
I mean, I also want to give people freedom to, establish their own rules and their own communities. Like, who are we to say, like, oh, you must have these other rules that we think are better? But I think sometimes we have to really be self-reflective and look at, okay, if we have a society that's just steeped in those behaviors, these assumptions that, oh, like you're less valuable if you're a certain age or a certain race or a certain gender identity, etc., or sexual orientation, I think we need to look at, do we want to replicate that in our own communities, or do we want to create a different world? Why are we doing this to begin with? Like, what are the values of polyamory that we're trying to bring more of, which is a sense of inclusive love.
Yes.
And a sense of, okay, like love is not as limited as we think it is. Like there's an abundance of it, and we want to feel more freedom in our love, in our sexual expression. So why not just open the doors wider and make sure that people who want to be there can feel comfortable there.
Absolutely. And that's definitely a theme that I've tried to cultivate with the communities that I have built. And I hope to see more and more of that elsewhere, right?
Yes.
So that's beautiful. Any other of the social aspects, or is it mainly that community piece?
That's it.
Got it.
That's it.
Okay.
That's really what came up from the research, is that community really makes a big difference. And I've seen that very, very clearly in my own coaching clients. Some people would start a non-monogamous journey and feel very isolated with their partner and feel very alone and scared. And then they would tap into a new community and make friends, and all of a sudden everything changed. Like, they would feel not alone. They would feel like, okay, like a very scary moment of my partner going on a date for the first time is still scary, but it's not terrifying. And it's not like as earth-shattering because I have someone I can talk to.
Yeah, I totally hear that. So I really appreciate you summarizing that for our listeners and myself. That was amazing. And I'm going to ask some questions maybe that might just dive a little bit deeper on some of that from your research and everything that you have created. Do you know if there's any individual skills or habits that, when conditioned and cultivated over time, are the greatest precursor to experiencing compersion?
Well, that would definitely go back to that individual category that I just talked about. That sense of cultivating inner security and inner resourcing. Things like self-care are actually super important. Like, people oftentimes in my research would tell me, like, oh, if I've had a great meal, if I've had a good night of sleep, if things are going well at work, if I can go on a walk in nature, I'm more likely to feel compersion than if I don't have these things, if my individual cup feels empty. So it's a matter of cultivating those habits that fill your cup so that you can feel like you have something to give.
That makes sense. And from even a coaching perspective, that is partly the responsibility in a way of that individual to figure out in some ways what fills their cup, because it's going to be different for every single person. Yeah. So what brings you joy individually so that you're showing up as the best version of you in each of your relationships.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. And I mean, there's those small things, the self-care things, everyday things, and then there's the bigger things too, like feeling in alignment with your own values and your own sense of purpose and your own sense of loving your life. That's really a big deal when it comes to then, like, feeling comfortable in your own skin in a non-monogamous context, which is, going to be quite challenging for most of us.
Absolutely. In terms of relational skills, is there any particular relational skills between partners that you've seen really nurture that atmosphere of compersion? Like, as you were talking, I was maybe thinking of when we're meeting each other's needs, maybe showing appreciation, showing gratitude, checking in, like, what are you needing? Is there anything more I can be giving you? Like, is there anything that has come up for you in your research?
Yeah. Everything you said is spot on.
Okay.
And I would add, the ability to give reassurance when needed.
Not see that as a burden, because I see that sometimes. Yeah.
Yeah. Like, I usually would recommend people make an explicit agreement around that. Like, oh, it's always okay to ask for reassurance. And, of course, there's the flip side of, well, if you're asking me for reassurance 10 times a day and I can never relax, then let's look further and look at what else we can do. But we're all going to get scared and insecure at some point. And if we can know that our partner is not going to reject us and not shame us for that and stay connected with us in those vulnerable moments, we can really build security.
That's really beautiful. And this is such a beautiful topic that we're having. And like you said, it can also be a charged topic, especially in certain communities. So what would you say are some of the common pitfalls when discussing compersion?
Well, first, there's the sometimes impression that compersion is toxic positivity. Like there are people, I've definitely heard people talk about it in almost like a toxic way of like, yeah, like, oh, I have compersion. I'm very compersive. And why don't you? You know, like trying to impose that feeling on other people. A little bit like some people would, like say, oh, I'm so happy all the time. Like everyone should just be happy all the time and not have compassion for the broad spectrum of human experience and not have compassion or tolerance for emotional pain and vulnerability. So that's one pitfall, is to use it as a stick to beat yourself with or other people with.
Yeah, and I love that analogy of the stick versus the flashlight. Yeah, and a lot of the work that I do, I talk about, beating yourself up with that gavel. But, I love that. Any visual, I think, can be really helpful.
Yeah.
And in terms of when we're thinking about going back again to, like, do you have any insights that you can give in helping identify when it is like a healthy growth type of a pain that people are feeling when they're experiencing maybe jealousy and they're working towards benevolent neutrality and ideally compersion, versus when there's pain that might be related to abuse? Any either questions one can ask or signs they can look for to help kind of pick that apart?
Yeah, I would really look at the context there. If you're experiencing emotional pain in a non-monogamous context, but you know that your relationships are full of respect and full of support and full of honesty and transparency, and really the pain that's coming up is not because you're being treated poorly, but because you are moving through the very natural growing pains of disentangling mononormativity from your system. And you're just really like faced with those narratives about love, those narratives like, oh, wow, like I don't know if my partner really has the ability to fully love me and fully love someone else. And they're giving me all the indications that they do love me, but there's still this kind of old narrative that says like, well, I don't think they can because maybe my parents got divorced because somebody had an affair and it ended up in heartbreak, and I still have that charge and that fear in my body. We can look at what is the pain rooted in. And if it is in a story that's not present tense, it's more of an older kind of story, it is an indication that maybe we are actually given the opportunity to heal and transform that old story. Versus, well, I've been really faced with a lot of evidence that my partner is not being honest with me. They're doing things outside of our agreements. My boundaries are constantly getting pushed. I don't feel like I'm actually being seen and loved and cared about. And if these things are true, then, oh my gosh, of course you're not going to feel compersion. And maybe you shouldn't, like that wouldn't be the thing you should try to feel. You should be trying to either heal your relationship ecosystem, which sometimes might include you have to not be with the partner that you're with, not in that way. Yeah. So yes, look at your context and what is causing the pain.
One thing I see sometimes in my work, and I'm curious also if you see this that often, is when somebody's being told there's a don't ask, don't tell agreement, yet you're just being told that by one of the partners, but therefore you're not able to have an honest conversation with the other person because I don't want to know about it. But then there's like almost like this veil of secrecy where you know it's like this big question mark, where is that person telling me the truth? Do they really have a don't ask, don't tell agreement with their partner? Because I imagine that would also be a barrier to feeling compersion, because you don't know if that person's lying to you or if they're telling the truth. But still, without, like, to your point about the metamors in the relationship, how can you trust someone that you don't have any relationship with at all and you've never even seen or spoken to? You know what I mean? So I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that. And that comes up for you in your coaching.
Well, yeah, I mean, it would be very difficult to experience full-blown compersion in a don't ask, don't tell relationship, or if someone in that ecosystem has a don't ask, don't tell, because that is kind of an indicator that, well, you can't have what I would coin in my book, a positive relational feedback loop. I know that's a long kind of word to talk about, like how in an ideal situation where everyone, knows of each other and ideally can talk to each other and have, a positive regard and know that everyone is on board and everyone is supportive of each other's relationship, there can be this sense of, okay, we have this positive loop of love and support for each other. But yeah, if someone in that ecosystem doesn't want to know, and yeah, we don't even know how honest these dynamics are, I mean, I understand why a lot of people in the non-monogamous community will not date someone who has a don't ask, don't tell policy. Or, might want to wait a few months and get to know that person, not get into an intimate relationship with them right away until you can know a little bit more. Like, are they solid? Are they, do they show signs of being very honest about what's happening? Are they willing to be friends, or are they just really in a hurry to get into an intimate relationship? And you can't really build trust there. Because if you can't build trust with the whole ecosystem, well, I mean, can you build trust with them? Is that available?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's everything you said there makes a whole lot of sense. And also, even getting back to that individual security, learning to trust yourself, trust your own intuition. If you are feeling pain, I always love the quote that pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional. So there is going to be some pain when you might feel when you're growing, and that's normal. But if you've been feeling pain for months or years, right, then that might be telling you something's not quite right here, and do I really, then it becomes suffering in a way. So I think I love how putting these things all together, like trusting your intuition, listening to your feelings, and then watching and collecting data about what's happening in that dynamic, and then making sure that you have that community so you can be having other people from the outside saying something about that doesn't seem right, or I think he treats you very well. You're going to have like that feedback loop too,
Yes, absolutely. And that's why also it's really useful and important to have a therapist or a coach or, a community of trusted people, of trusted peers to have that sounding board.
Yeah.
I mean, we all have our blind spots, it's hard to sometimes distinguish what is our true intuition from what is a pain-based story and ego mechanism, we need other people. We need to have other sounding boards around us.
Yeah, 100%. Everything you're saying makes complete sense to me, and also what I've seen and even experienced myself. So I think one of the last questions I have is, do you think that compersion is necessary for successful consensually non-monogamous or polyamorous relationships?
I love that question. So I would say yes and no. And I know it's a little bit controversial to even say yes to that question, because most people would say like, no, it shouldn't be necessary because we don't want to create any sense of pressure. And I totally agree with that when it comes to emotional or embodied compersion. I don't think emotional or embodied compersion is necessary. I think that's a bonus when you can get it. But I think that attitudinal compersion, or at least, something close to benevolent neutrality, which, like the line between benevolent neutrality and attitudinal compersion can be a bit fuzzy there, but at least interpreting your partner's other relationships as a positive or at least an okay event, that is more fundamental to successful non-monogamy. Because if you don't even have that, that means that you are probably going to interpret your metamor relationships as a negative event. And that is really grounds for conflict and distress.
Yeah. And also, as one gets to know oneself, that individual element again, somebody may realize, hey, I maybe orient towards monogamy, and maybe I want to be in a monogamous relationship, and maybe this type of growth is not the growth that I want to be doing, or I don't feel like I have the desire, right? And so I always like to say with my work that it's totally okay to identify as monogamous and to choose that. It's just making sure that you're doing your own research and your own growth to make sure it's a conscious choice, and that you are doing, like you said, making that decision from a place of strength and empowerment and autonomy. And the same goes the other way. The same goes for choosing consensual non-monogamy. Yeah,
absolutely, absolutely. I personally would identify as ambiamorous or even novogamous, to use a more recent term coined by Dr. Jorge Ferrer. And that means that some of us will not necessarily be either fully always monogamous or fully always polyamorous, but be able to kind of flow depending on what the circumstances call for. I definitely consider myself polyhearted. Like I do believe I can love many people and people can love many people at the same time. But there's definitely relationships in my life that have been monogamous, not from a place of coercion, but from a place of choice of like, oh, I just really want to be with that one person and it's mutual and let's choose monogamy from a place of freedom, not from a place of fear or default. I think that's totally valid.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I can't thank you enough. This has been a beautiful conversation. You're just so articulate. And I just want to, again, say thank you for all of the research that you've done. It's been an honor to get to know you over the years. I hope someday we get to meet in person. I have no doubt that we will. So where can people find you and your work and your book, of course?
Oh, thank you, Kitty. So the best place to go is my website, whatiscompersion.com. It's the title of my book. It's really easy to remember. You can also book a free 30-minute introductory session with me as a coach if you want to, go deeper into compersion or any other aspect of dating and relationships. I love talking to people. And I also have an Instagram, which is @love_insight_dating, where I post all my announcements and content on compersion and everything else. So yeah, please find me and stay in touch.
Sounds amazing. Well, thank you again so much for your work, and I wish you nothing but absolute wonderful success with everything.
Thank you so much, Kitty. It's so great to talk to you again. And yes, I hope we meet in person one day.
Yeah, it's great to talk to you again, too.
Cheers.
Thanks for tuning in to today's show. If you like what you heard, are struggling with some aspect of your relationships, and you're interested in seeing if you're a fit to work with me as your relationship coach, here's what I invite you to do next. Head over to lovingwithoutboundaries.com/apply. That's lovingwithoutboundaries.com/apply. And book a call to speak with me. I'll get on the phone with you for about 45 minutes, and we'll get you crystal clear on 3 things. Number 1, exactly what's not working well in your relationships right now. Number 2, ideally where you'd like to be and what might be getting in the way. And number 3, the exact strategy to get you there, helping to close that gap. Remember, creating healthy, open relationships does not typically happen by itself. Many often need expert guidance to make it happen. We've helped clients all over the world to feel safe, happy, and secure in open relationships, while not losing their mind or their cherished partners. To see if we can help you do the same, head over to lovingwithoutboundaries.com/apply. I'm Kitty Chambliss, and let's talk soon.